If you've been here at all before, you know that we are going to start an Alpha course. I am now going to tell you when. It's going to be Wednesday, March 8th is the first session at 6 p.m. So if you heard about the prayer time that Kathy was talking about from 4 to 6, it's right after that. And some of you have already volunteered. I will get back to you. If anybody else is interested in becoming part of the team that puts this on, because this is not a one-person thing. This takes a team. It involves food. It involves video and teaching. And it involves small groups and allows the freedom to ask anything. Sue mentioned the freedom class at Northwest Harvest. And by the way, it may sound crazy that one church is promoting what's going on in another church, but we are one church. One church. We just happen to be here, and this is us. And my friend John at Northwest Harvest is a dear friend. This is what God's called him to do. And I can tell you that that is for believers to enrich. Alpha is to bring people in who have these questions. And growing up in the church, or if I don't know, maybe this is not your experience. Sometimes if you grow up in the church, the difficult questions never get addressed until you leave home, go somewhere else, and if you want to know what happens in college, that's when the difficult questions get asked. And when you're not prepared, you have no answer. So this is a chance for the community to ask questions, absolutely from the framework of Jesus. But it's allowing them to discover. It's not trying to correct and push. It's just a discovery. Why? This is what. I mean, which one of us, even still as believers, don't ask, if God is good, why is there so much hurt? Now, we can understand, but if you're out there, what's the answer? So, that's what Alpha is. There are small little cards out at the information table that are great ways to start the conversation with a friend, a coworker, to invite them. Because it's also for you, but if it's only us, we can do it on Sunday morning. This is to bring other people in. And if it's one person or 100 people, it's whoever God brings to us. And just think about it. If you have an opportunity to at least introduce somebody to Christ, why not? And it can be a difficult thing to do. But my guess is that those of you who live your life out each day as a believer, they already know. They're just waiting for you to ask. They already know. There are people I worked with in the state legislature. When I became a pastor, it's, well, of course. They already know. It's how you live your life. They're not perfect. Absolutely not perfect. But, and I don't need to tell you all my faults. But they know. They're just waiting for you to ask. It's a great opportunity to just allow people to be introduced to Christ. I think there was something else, but I don't remember. So, 1 Corinthians. A couple weeks ago, I was talking about chapter 5, where we had Paul addressing the church because a believer, a professing believer, was sleeping with his father's wife, and they were proud. And when I accepted this call, I determined myself to not avoid the difficult discussions. And there are parts in the Bible that generally you may not hear in churches because they're difficult and they may make people feel uncomfortable. But we did it, and a few of you gave me some feedback, and it was very positive, and I appreciate that. Today's more uncomfortable. I don't know what could be more uncomfortable than kick him out of the church, but love him as a non-believer and bring him back into the church. But, today, and maybe it's me, I am more uncomfortable with this one. Because I think the context is everything, just like it has been, whether we're talking about lawsuits between believers or sexual immorality or division in the church or claiming I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, which is all the things we've covered so far. And now we have the beginning of the chapter in 7 where Paul says, in response to, Paul is responding to questions that we don't have. There's another letter somewhere. Them back to Paul, whatever else. And so we know the answers, but we don't know the questions. So we have to kind of develop what the question is. And I spent a lot of time reading a lot of things this week and still feel like God's going to have to do something because I don't have it all up here right now. But let's take a look at the culture. We know Corinth was a bustling city. We also know that this was a city that worshiped sex. And just to be plain and simple, that's what they did. This was where the temple to Aphrodite was. This is where the culture of the city was sex. So then we get into Paul talking about divisions in the church, talking about you're celebrating this and you're prideful. And he's addressing that. Today he's addressing the division and how some people went way the other direction. Never happens in our society today, right? Somebody has an extreme view here, so you can't stay the course. You have to go to an extreme view over here. Or let me just be fair. Somebody has an extreme view here, and you can't stay the course. You go to an extreme view there. This is what the church did. Crazy. The culture says it's sex. So this starts off with the question, is it better to just avoid it altogether? To the point where people in Corinth, in the church, I don't know if it was a different body or if it's one big body or what, but at least this group, either earlier in response to or because of Paul's correction, we don't know, decided that it was better to avoid sex altogether. In fact, they were justifying divorce as a way to become single so that they could be more spiritual. That doesn't happen in our society, right? We don't take something that God said and then add to it so we feel real comfortable or we feel extra spiritual, and then that becomes the law in the church, right? And if you're really a believer, if you want to come through the doors, you have to experience it the same way I do. That's how we got denominations, right? It's inherently not bad. If God calls you, although he won't call you to divorce, you made the vow in front of him. These lights up here, if you didn't know, were because we had a wedding yesterday. And Lane and Kendra, I thought they'd still be in church today, but they aren't. It was a beautiful wedding. And that was one of the things that they did at communion, and it was right up here. They also had 3 strands, and they wove these strands together. So this is a vow based on the foundation of the rock of Christ, where it's the 3 of them together. Paul says, no, don't divorce. That's not right. In fact, sex and intimacy was made for marriage. That's where it's supposed to be. And he even talks about it. There must have been a lot of different questions. Because he even says, now, if you choose, the 2 of you, to take a break as a fast or whatever it is, Don't do it long, because Satan will tempt you. And that's not healthy. This is the place for it. And then encourages people to, with regularity, your body is not yours. You are one. And he talks about that. Now, I bring the context in because if you take a look at chapter 7 and say, oh, here's Paul describing what marriage is, without realizing the background of where they're coming from and who he's addressing, you get a skewed view of what marriage is. Because if you don't read all the other letters, and if you don't read what God had created, he created us in his image, both male and female. It's not good to be lonely. And then he said, be fruitful and multiply. By the way, that's something in the church years ago where sex was only for multiplication, not intimacy. That's not right either. It really feels weird to say the word sex up here. But, that's what we're talking about. That's what Paul wrote about. So then he talks about, and put this in the context of, back then, marriage was determined for you. My friends. Marriage was determined for you. I don't know whether that meant no one got to choose their own spouse, but I do know in reading and in history that a lot of times they were arranged marriages. And he talks about, if you're single, that's honorable. In fact, if you don't have that burning desire to be married, being single is a good thing. He's single. And he talks about the ability to spend more time pursuing God. And think about this. I have a wife. I have 5 children. 4 of them have spouses. And then number 10 grandchild's on the way. My ability for change is limited because I made a vow, right? In the eyes of God. My ability to say, yep, tomorrow I'm headed to Southern California to preach, or I'm headed to Africa, or I'm headed to New York. It's limited. If I'm worried about my food, that's one thing. If I'm worried about food and shelter for the people that God has given me, put in my care, it's not restrictive. The family dynamic, my dynamic is different. If you're single like Paul, then you can travel all through what we call Turkey today, visiting churches, writing letters, and doing the ministry. So there's a different calling. And Paul is specific to, if you're called to be single, be single. If you're called to be married, be married. In fact, if you're married, don't act like you're single. And if you're single, don't act like you're married. The act like meaning sexually. He's called us, he, not Paul, he, God, has called us to live out the life he has called us to live out. He even talks about you don't have to change just because you're now a believer. If you were a Gentile, you don't become a Jew. If you were a Jew, you don't become a Gentile. If you are married, don't become unmarried. If you're unmarried, you don't have to be married. That's a big one in our church today. You can't tell me. In fact, I have a friend who says, I've got several friends actually, who say that are single, that say, the thing people ask are you seeing anybody? It's just our culture, within the church especially. It's our culture. Are you seeing anybody? Oh, well, I'll pray for you. Well, it's almost like it's a sin. It's not. In fact, if that's what God has called you to, it's a blessing because you are free to follow and pursue what God has called you to pursue. And the same if you're married. You've made a vow. I don't think I could survive single. My whole world revolves around my family. And I know that's not the case for everybody who's married. I understand that. I've already told you I feel extremely blessed. But that's where my world revolves around. Yet, so I'm not equipped to be single. Yet there are people who are actually equipped to be single. And I know that's strange in our society. Well, actually, it's not strange in our society. Did you know that half of the adults over the age of 18 in our society are single? That's actually down. Used to be more. But here's why it's more. 20 years ago, if I remember the numbers right, I'm generally a numbers person, but I may be off, 17% of the single people had never been married. Today, 33% of the single people have never been married. So what does our culture teach about being single? I have not heard, except maybe in the church, that while you're single, just step right into what God's got you, what He's called you to do, who He's called you to be. Step into that. You know what I hear in this culture? You need to find yourself. You need to make money. You need to be successful here. You need to do this. You need to do this. You need this, and lay a foundation. And then, when you're whatever age and all the dust is settled, because I'm not sure there's actually an age where that happens, then you can get married and find someone who's also found themselves. You know what the problem is with that? That's not God's design. God's design is, walk with me. I'll tell you who you're supposed to be. That's that freedom class we talked about. I will tell you what I have for you. And the worst thing for marriage is to not discover those things together. That is what it's about. It's doing life together, not getting your life all together and then joining someone else. So there's this thing that Paul's trying to deal with in correcting the church, even to the point of arranged marriages. If you are like it's arranged, yet you feel like you should be single, that's okay, be single. But if you're single now and you really feel like you should be married, get married. And that's what all 40 verses are talking about. They were, and we have skewed what this is supposed to look like. But here's the larger picture. This is just talking about sex, because in their day, the culture was sex. Our day, it's sex, but what else? They also had some persecution. Now, you can feel persecuted. I guarantee you it's nothing like what they felt in Corinth with the Romans there. But what else is it in our culture today that is either so far out there that we take what God says here and we go all the way out here? I don't have an answer, because you all experience that in a daily way that I don't, and I experience it in a different way than you do. But there are things that we do. I can tell you that if you look at social media and stuff, there's this crazy thing with all of the analytics that go on. As soon as you put title pastor in your social media, more stuff comes up related to the church. It's just crazy. I can't even say it. Oh, yeah, my phone's right here. That means I'm going to have more stuff come up now, okay? But if you look at what the church is doing to itself right now on social media, I'm interested, I'm drawn in, because they actually market this stuff and they know how humans think and they know what's going to draw me in. That's a whole other topic. Social media is it's not something for you. It's actually, you're the product they're selling. So I'm looking at all this going back and forth with preachers and churches of our day. And it seems like all we're doing is calling each other out and moving one extreme to the other extreme. Yeah, your church, you should be over here because they're way over there and you need to move this way, and if you're not, you're a heretic. And instead of following what God says, if you're out there, you're a heretic. And if you move over to them, then you're a heretic. And all we're doing is calling each other out. It's the same division that Paul's talking about in Corinth. It's exactly what's going on. There's a couple things I want to finish with. I was reading, it may surprise you, but I was reading. James Emery White, and I'd never come across this magazine before, but Outreach Magazine. And I won't read the whole article, I'm just going to try to get it down, because it deals with what's our responsibility, what's our role. He says, we have tried at least 4 approaches, historically, the church has, for cultural engagement. What is our response to our culture? How are we supposed to deal with this? They're retreat, revive, recapture, and reflect. And he suggests that none of them have succeeded. To retreat, the strategy of retreat is what marked much of American fundamentalism and still typifies our approach of many Christ followers. And none of these are bad, but they're lacking. This involves pulling back from the culture and creating a subculture of our own that acts like a protective bubble against the corrosive influence of the world around us. It's just us, just this little bubble. And the theme that you get from all of these is we are in the world, not of the world, but we are in the world. That's retreat. Second one's revive. A second strategy is a quest to revive the culture. The resolve to pray for and the desire to experience the experience of revival can be found throughout the Bible narrative, and few would deny that the cultural impact of such movements are stuff that God can bring. But again, we're not injected into the culture the same. Now, there's revival going on right now. Absolutely, and it's amazing. There's also retreat going on right now, and it protects people who may be subject, potentially part of the culture. Third one, recapture. A third approach is perhaps the most familiar. It's the conscious attempt to recapture the culture for Christ. That makes sense to me. We reflect let's go to the next one. Culture for Christ. Much of this is rooted in the idea that ours was once a Christian nation, and we should actively work to return our governing bodies and laws back to the original intent. Changes that a little bit, huh? Recapture. God doesn't ignore governments. And, that's been most of my career. But don't confuse our earthly governments with the heavenly kingdom. Don't confuse a preference for political ideology with what God's called you to do and what Jesus said to do, and to reach people for him and to share the gospel and to make disciples and to take care of the widows and the poor. Because the way I read it, nobody's got a market in all those. Not politically. Don't confuse the two. The fourth one is reflect. This is kind of part of the recapture, but the reflect approach is perhaps the most aptly termed a reflect strategy, like a mirror. We reflect the culture and its values. Rather than trying to take over the culture, we embrace the culture in the attempt to bring all things to men so that by all things, become all things to men so that by all possible means we might save some. We have to be careful with that one too. All of these things are good, but they all lack, especially if you get off into only one strategy. So what he suggests is there's something to be said for all of these strategies. They all fall short of an ultimate goal. Instead of retreat, revival, recapture, or reflection, he suggests we should take the best of all four, aim for something deeper and more lasting, and he calls it renewal. Now, these are just our words. It's really cute. It's a nice way to write an article to keep people engaged. But let's find out what he talks about renewal. We are to be witnesses. We are to make disciples. We are to do justice, love mercy, feed the hungry, care for the widow and the orphan. This is far from pursuing a privatized faith. We are called to be present in the culture as salt. The idea is transformation. This leads to transformation. We can't be so afraid of what the culture's doing that we go way off on the other side and make our own legalism. Here's one that's going on in our culture today. Within the church, spiritual discipline. You may not know this, but some people say that if you focus too much on spiritual discipline, it's become an idol. I would say that's true. I'd say Paul agrees with that. If your focus is on the discipline as opposed to why you're being disciplined, absolutely. But you know what the response of some are? So I don't engage in spiritual discipline. That makes no sense. It's not make it an idol or don't do it at all. It's what does God have for you today? If you're married, stay married. If you're single and that's what God's called you to do, if you're married and you're married already. If you're single and God's called you to be married, be married. If you're single and God's called you to be single, stay single and know that it's a blessing. We're each called differently. That's okay. In fact, it's not just okay, it's right. He says there's no reason to change. If you're a slave and you become a believer, does your position as a slave change your ability to worship the Almighty God and to follow what He's called you to do and who to be? No. He says, if you are given your freedom, take it. But I would say this, if you're married, does that interfere with your ability to become who God's called you to be? Absolutely not. And if you're single, does that interfere your ability to become who God has called you to be? Absolutely not. But this message isn't just limited to sex or slavery or singleness or marriage. There are other things in our lives, other things that churches impose, other things societies impose that we have to wrestle with. We're all called a little bit different. We all have a different place to live. We all have different jobs. We all have different money. We all have different health issues. And none of those things should get in the way of your ability to become who God has called you to be. Because then that's become an idol. So I'm going to have the worship team come back up. My prayer is that we will understand what the culture is, that we will live in the world, but not become of the world, that we will be able to stand our ground and not react in a human way to the culture, but react in a godly way and stay firm. But here's what happens. You will be criticized. You will be criticized. Absolutely. You will be criticized often from within and without. This is not about that. This is about you and Him. Not me, but your neighbor. This is you and Him. Father, thank you so much for your love. Thank you for your teaching and your guidance. Lord, help us to take your word and impress it upon our hearts, Lord, in the way, in the meaning, and how it impacts our life in the way you have it for us to be impacted. Father, we love you. We thank you for your Spirit. We thank you for your grace. Help each one of us here to recognize you as we go through our day and how you are impacting us and the people around us, Lord. Help us to be kind to those you've called us to be kind to be generous, to show your grace and mercy and your justice, Lord.